Num num. Birdie num num.
When I have understanding of computers, I shall be the supreme being. God isn't interested in technology. He knows nothing of the potential of the microchip or the silicon revolution. Look how he spends his time. 43 species of parrots. Nipples for men.
Don't do that, Jesus Christ! You're gonna get me killed! Out of here!
Oh, Billy.
I have nipples, Greg. Could you milk me?
Welcome, everybody, to AB Live. And yes, that was probably a little weird for us. I should have maybe warned our guest about it. But yes, this is a world where men have nipples and, yeah, a lot of high weirdness. My name is Miguel Connor. I am your Pompatus of Gnosis and very excited for this show, as it definitely is an analog to so many of the themes of this podcast. So we are very happy to be here. Happy Friday, happy Freya Day to all of you. And with us, as always, it's great to have my friend and a scholar and writer who I greatly admire, and that is Eric G. Wilson. Eric, thank you very much for coming back.
Miguel, as always, it is my total pleasure. Good to see you again.
Good to see you. And with us, we also have my favorite American since Jesus Christ, and that is the Moondog Vance. Vance, how are you doing?
Oh, I'm okay. I brought a guest too today. Here he is. Tardigrade.
Oh, yeah. Those creatures that can live anywhere.
Isn't that weird? He's weird. Yeah.
That's weird.
Yeah, well, that's what we're going to get into very much. We will be discussing Eric's new book, How to Be Weird, an off-kilter guide to living a one-of-a-kind life. And yeah, it was a great book, great exercises. Some are short, some are long, and they definitely go into the ethos of the esoterica. And I laughed a lot at this book. So, Eric, what made you decide to write How to Be Weird?
I think it actually grows out of my relationship with my daughter. I mentioned that a little bit in the introduction. When she was very little, 2, 3, 4 years old, I was going through somewhat of a dark time, mental health wise. And my therapist said, connecting with your daughter would probably make you feel better. But for a guy like you, you're not going to be a good traditional father. You can't really convey values to her. You can't really teach her how to be a respectable citizen, but you're kind of funny in a really disturbing way. So just whatever you can do to make her laugh, no matter how bizarre, that's what you should do. So we started making up these really crazy games. And that just kind of lived on in our lives to where she and I periodically would just be sitting together in the car and get kind of that strange vibe. And I would say, do you feel weird? She's like, do you feel weird? Hey, I feel a little weird. So that's flippant and whimsical. But given my spiritual interest, I started realizing that weirdness is ultimately a kind of spiritual category. And in fact, it's a Gnostic category because not necessarily theologically, but psychologically, I'm sure we'll get into that. But, the demiurge, metaphysically or psychologically, wants us to think life is okay and that everything is smooth and life is predictable and that our habits are useful. But sometimes we get, to mention the Matrix, we feel that splinter in the mind that makes us think, well, maybe things aren't all right. Maybe things aren't real. What is going on here? And that feeling can be disturbing and uncanny and insecure and disorienting. But that can also open us up to the kind of richness and sublimity and infinity of spiritual experience.
Very much indeed. In fact, I wrote down some quotes. Here's one. Of course, I went for the more Gnostic quotes, but this is in one of your exercises. We are the butts of a cosmic joke. Don't be a bad sport. Get in the laughter. So basically, yeah, this is the demiurge's world. We're in this cosmic prison. So just have a good time, right?
Well, yeah. I mean, the problem I faced in my life and the people I dislike the most are those that take themselves too seriously. And that's another part of this book is just we need to be more self-effacing, more ironic towards ourselves, more willing to laugh at ourselves. And again, that's another way. Anything you can do to kind of like knock the ego aside a little bit, poke it, jeer it. However that happens, it's always a good thing, I believe. And this book is partially written in that spirit too. And so I hope there is a kind of quirky, sarcastic humor from time to time in the book.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. How your daughter told your fiance, life. Why do you guys play these weird games? And she's like, "Well, life is boring," and she is right. I mean, boredom is a mind killer, isn't it?
Yeah.
The dreads. It reminds me of this quote from Caitlin Johnstone, who said, "The opposite of life isn't death; it's habit." And we all get into that, right? I mean, we all have good entrepreneurial habits and get up and write our stuff, write your book at 6 a.m. But that can turn us into Gurdjieff machines, don't you think?
Well, William James, one of my favorite philosophers, says that genius is nothing more than perceiving the world in an unhabitual way. And I think connected to that is Emily Dickinson's poem about poetry, where she says, "I dwell in possibility, a fairer house than prose." Just opening moments in our daytime when we feel like we're pushed from the actual to the potential, when we're kind of veering from the linear to maybe the spiral. I think the more we can do that, the more we can surprise ourselves, the better. And I think that's really the purpose of almost all these exercises in some ways, is let's surprise ourselves with ourselves and see what happens next. Because you're right. I mean, boredom. Well, my mom used to say this on a Saturday, like, "Well, Mom, I'm bored." She would say, "Well, boredom's a failure of the imagination." Ooh. Pretty harsh thing to, I mean, she was a school teacher. It's kind of a pretty harsh thing to say. It's like, Mom, that's a lot of pressure. But there's something true about that. So, I mean, the book's about weirdness, but also it's about creativity. It's about imagination. It is about spiritual experience. I write in my second exercise about this Zen concept known as Yugen, which is this term for sort of wandering out into this landscape that is new to you with no thought of return. In other words, you're just walking to walk. You're not going anywhere. And I didn't actually put this in the book, but this is an interesting story. I was in college and I was in the coffee shop and I was reading this famous book on the history of religion by Houston Smith. I think it's, everybody knows that book, right? I think it's like the history of world religion or world religion.
Right.
I was reading the chapter on Buddhism, and this dude just appeared out of nowhere, and he was like really thin. He had on a fedora, and he had on like a kind of a zoot suit, and he was wearing spats of all things. And this is in Boone, North Carolina. This is like podunk realm. Like, who the hell are you? It's like he just appeared. And he said, "Have you ever heard the story about the student who took a class on Zen Buddhism?" Like, "Well, what's that story?" He said, "Well, the student turned in an essay of 10 blank pages because he thought his professor would see that he knew the essence of Buddhism, which is all form is emptiness." Well, the professor gave him an F. And then the student said, "Why did you do that? I know the essence of Zen." And the professor said, "If you're a true Zen Buddhist, you won't care that you got an F," which is a great story. But I got to know this guy a little bit. His name was Jed. He was a very strange dude. And he taught me that he'd been reading a lot of Alan Watts. And Alan Watts is big on the idea that the best gurus are tricksters. They're not out to sort of reinforce a dogma, to teach you a discipline like the 7 steps to enlightenment. They're just doing anything they can to throw you off, basically, to kind of shock you out of your ego and your habits. So that experience with Jed, I don't know where the hell he is now, is really kind of integral to the book. It was a real, I was a freshman in college, so it was a real sort of mind bender. So this book is written in that sort of tricksterish spirit. The idea that the best teachers don't reinforce what we already know, but they push us into a kind of intellectual and emotional chaos.
Yeah, it makes sense. And yeah, as I'm sure all three of us Gen Xers know that a big part of our growing up was battling boredom. Hey, let's get stoned, watch a movie, and we're just sort of sitting around, slackers. Yeah, it was this fight. And yeah, of course, the society is built for that. But yeah, it was a good fight. And yeah, there's one part, Eric, where you talk about falling asleep on your laptop to Donnie Darko. I was like, did you not have the greatest mystical experience in the I mean, your subconscious absorbing this stuff?
Well, so in my introduction, I do talk about various weird experiences, like deja vu, like getting lost and returning to the same place over and over again. But one of them is the hypnagogic experience. And we've all had this experience where we're watching a movie and we fall asleep and we start dreaming, but the movie kind of shows up in our dream. And at those moments, we feel like, whoa, what's outside of my head is now inside of my head. And what was inside of my head is now outside of my head. And these are wonderful, uncanny experiences that people like Edgar Allan Poe and Samuel Taylor Coleridge just love. But Donnie Darko goes deep for me. We may have talked about that at some point, Miguel. It's such a great Gnostic film. In fact, I have a T-shirt with the head of the Donnie Darko rabbit on it. And I walk around town and no one knows what the hell it is, but occasionally someone will say, dude, Donnie Darko. Dude. I'm like, I found my person. It's like a test. If you know what this shirt means, I'll be your friend.
Your secret Valentinian club or lodge.
Exactly. Yes.
Oh, it's such an amazing movie. Well, I guess as we're going on, people are asking, well, what is weird? Again, it's one of those terms we all use it. We all throw it around in our own context. But how would you define weird, Eric?
Yeah, I would define it as kind of it can move one of two directions. A weird experience occurs when what we think we know really well, the familiar, suddenly becomes strange. Like, to give you a kind of banal example, if you're in, say, a wax museum and you're like looking at these celebrities in wax and suddenly one seems to move or blink at you, or a doll seems to blink at you. It's like, whoa, that's not supposed to happen. So the defamiliarization of the familiar can be one form of weird, but also it can be the other direction as well, when something really whacked out, like a crazy film, like, say, Todd Browning's Freaks, say, or you find yourself in a strange city at nighttime. Those moments that feel totally outre suddenly feel familiar. It's like that something in your heart resonates with that event that seems so unsettling to you just seconds before. So I guess I would say that weird is not something just like totally whacked out. It's something that is close to us, but we don't quite know it yet. So that's why I feel like it's the everyday becoming not the everyday, or the not everyday becoming the everyday. And my exercises in this regard aren't crazy. I mean, they really are little nudges and pokes and invitations to see things a different way. For instance, I have an exercise. Salvador Dali, the great surrealistic painter, and I see that Vance has a Dali-esque clock behind him, which I'm gratified to see. He would fall asleep with pennies in his hand or ball bearings in his hand. And just as he would fall asleep, the hand would open, relax, and the pennies would fall on the floor. And he would immediately write down the first thought in his mind, or immediately paint the first image in his head. So it's sort of a hypnagogic exercise where what's happening in your sleep world, you can spontaneously express in your waking world. And who knows what's going to come out? You just don't know. It may be ridiculous and you may never think about it again, but it may be an idea or an image or a word that you can build something on.
Oh, yes, indeed. There's so many insights in that. And yeah, like I tell people, if you want to be weird, you don't have to go full, you don't have to, show up to work dressed as Gene Simmons or Paul Stanley. You can do simple things like take a different route to work. When you walk to your car, just hop like a bunny for a few seconds, wear different lipstick. These are things that can sort of break you out of normative reality. And like you said, trick your ego to sort of look at different ways of the world. Do you get to do that as a professor? I mean, I know we talked in our as fellow bipolars, when we're up we do weird things anyway and people look at us, but do you get to sort of play with this as a professor?
Oh yeah. I guess in some ways, the older I get, the less likely I am to do something like really Dada-esque in class. I mean, I used to jump up on the desk, for instance, really just to kind of shock students into like, what would you do if I did this? Or I would throw chalk across the room. And back in the old days, I'd throw chalk at the student sleeping. Can't do that anymore. I'd probably lose my job. But There were other times when I would read an Emily Dickinson poem. I say, you know what it feels like to read an Emily Dickinson poem? Well, she says a poem is good if you feel like the top of your head's been blown off. So I'd read the poem and I would like go, boom. And one time I did it so hard, I gave myself a concussion. So, it's like, whoa,
Oh, no.
for real. This is like 15 years ago. But the answer is yes. I feel like to be a good teacher, you have to be, again, that kind of trickster. You have to be playful, or you should be playful, and really just try to shake your students up however you can. And that's really what I love most about teaching. And a lot of these exercises came out of the classroom. I teach creative writing workshops. And for years, I've sort of tried ways to get students to activate their imagination in class. And especially the exercises having to do with language come right out of those classes, like make up your own curse word, or make up a sentence with the language you made up entirely. Think of a book title that doesn't exist and write a review of it. I mean, those sorts of things are just ways to activate the literary imagination.
Yes, indeed. And I wanted to ask you sort of a side question too. Kind of, I had obviously in our last talk, we talked about these are weird times to say the least. It seems the trickster spirit has just taken over the United States. And people think, well, oh my God, these are such hard times. And they are hard times. But in your experience, especially as this show becomes more dedicated to Hermes, the trickster, because as many Jungians say, this is the age of Hermes, the god of transitions, of doorways, of insanity, but innovation. During the Romantic period, did any of the poets A, invoke Hermes, B, talk about wisdom of surviving times? Because people again today are like, oh, this is the worst time. It's like, no, during the Romantic period, there were Napoleonic wars, revolutionary, there was smallpox that was killing millions of people in the United States and Europe. There were hard times. It's the old Gandalf and Frodo. Nobody wants to be in these times, but you do the best. But any wisdom from the Romantics on how to survive these changing times?
Yes, and you're right to say that. I would say from the time the French Revolution broke out until 1815, the Battle of Waterloo, England was basically a police state. There was such a fear of the French attacking, especially when Napoleon took over, and there was such a fear of spies within England that habeas corpus was suspended for years. So if you were just in a pub whispering with someone about French insurrection, you could be thrown in the tower or worse, beheaded.
So William Blake spent time in jail for sedition too.
Well, for a brief time, that's right. He was just out sailing with some friends on the river, and the authorities thought he was a spy. So yeah, I mean, it was a very scary time. And I would say when you say romanticism, I'm thinking of the so-called Big Six romantic poets: Blake, Wordsworth, Coleridge, Byron, Keats, Shelley. Right. And I would say there are kind of three different responses among these, depending on which poet. And I'll be brief about this, but someone like Blake was very much aware that the Orthodox religion of his time, Anglican Christianity, and the monarchy were in total cahoots with one another. Basically, the church's job was to tell the citizens who were unjustly treated that this is what God wants for you, that this is part of God's plan. So religion in Blake's time was ultimately a reinforcement of the status quo. And Blake knew that Anglican religion was just one myth among many myths, and because all religions are myths created by poets. So his strategy was to create counter myths, which is a classic Gnostic strategy, as you know, like rewriting the book of Genesis. How many Gnostic texts do that? So his idea was, let's imagine another world that will allow us to question the status quo, but also invite us each to create in our own way. Someone like Wordsworth was much more grounded in the material world. His idea was that let's go to the natural world, and the natural world is a place of spontaneity, a place of childlikeness, a place of freedom. And if we can try to mesh our imaginations with the natural world, that's a way to kind of push against the demiurge. But Lord Byron had the more hermetic way. He was more in the Hermes camp. He wrote this great poem, a 24-book poem called Don Juan. We would say Don Juan, but we know from his rhyme scheme that he wanted us to anglicize it, Don Juan. And this is one of the first works that kind of breaks the fourth wall, where Byron will be writing about his hero, Don Juan, and suddenly like break out and say, whoa, I'm really hungover today. I can barely write this sentence. So it's like he's constantly sort of mocking himself while writing. And to me, this becomes a model of sort of living ironically. But not irony as sarcasm, but irony is a kind of generous skepticism, a willingness to question what you're doing at any given time, not to shut it down, but just to open up possibly different ways of doing what you're doing. But also it becomes a way to question the status quo, knowing that any worldview is a construct, one construct among many other constructs. Mm-hmm. That doesn't mean they're all the same. Some are better than others. The ones that are better than others foster more connection and kindness and generosity. The worst ones foster power and hierarchy. So Byron was very on to that. And this irony he practiced was a way of basically saying, ultimately, any way we try to describe the world is inadequate to the superabundance and the mystery of the world. So we shouldn't take any worldview that seriously, but we should try to cultivate worldviews that are more open to the strangeness and the mystery of the universe. That's more the Hermes spirit, I think.
Oh, yeah. The idea of imagination, contemplation, and all that. Yeah, and Don Juan, as you call it. Yeah, Byron, I think, wrote it in, of all places, Sintra, Portugal. Or he had a house there. I've been to or walked by his house there. So,
he was a great world traveler. I mean, and he well, not world travel. He traveled all around Europe, and he did spend time in Portugal, Lisbon. Of course, he died in Greece. He tried to raise money for a Greek army to fight against Turkey, and died of dysentery, probably in the trenches. But Byron was a fascinating man. He's the most Gnostic in some ways of the poets, not idea wise, but in that he was a total hedonist. I mean, any moral convention he threw to the winds. Yeah.
An old corporation.
That's right. I mean, you can go one of two ways as a Gnostic, right? You can sort of deny the flesh, or you can totally give into the flesh.
Yeah, exactly. Well, yeah, that's definitely good advice, as I tell people, and I learned this from Jungian therapy and other things. If your worldview is bad, you can change it, and people, that's impossible. Yes, your beliefs, how you were raised, they're all constructs. You can find a completely different. Your inner goodness or your consciousness is not going to change. So just find a new worldview, destroy your worldview, and move on.
We deserve the worldview we create. I mean, I think if you and I know this, Miguel. I mean, in some ways, if you're really, really depressed, you're just living in a inadequate worldview. Right? You can come up with a different worldview. I feel like the practice of mindfulness, which isn't necessarily a Jungian practice, but the practice of mindfulness really opened me to this, the idea that we do create our realities. And if you're not feeling great, well, try to create a different reality.
The reality tunnels, right? Robert Anton Wilson.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Get to a dead end.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, you were talking about, there's one exercise about earworms, and I'm like, damn it. Eric has the same earworm I have, which is Toto's Africa. That song comes into my head at least twice. So somebody will say, I bless, and I'll go, the rain's down in Africa.
Yeah, I know. Well, see, I love that you brought that exercise. I mean, we all have earworms. And but just a quick aside, I don't know how long it's been since you've watched that video for Toto's Africa from the 80s. But this was a time before rock stars needed to worry about how they looked. I mean, all those guys are just like 45-year-old dudes, and they just don't care how they look at all.
Mustache and the mustache.
It's amazing. Wearing members only jackets, probably. But so we all have the earworms, and we're probably irritated at the earworms. But what would happen if you wrote out the lyrics to the earworm out of Africa by hand, and say your favorite poet's Lord Byron, and then you write Lord Byron at the bottom, and just imagine, what if Lord Byron had written that song? And suddenly the song changes a little bit, and suddenly Lord Byron changes a little bit. It's a minor moment, but again, it's just another way to take what we just assume is an everyday part of life and make it just a little wonky for a minute. And it's fun. Ultimately, the weirdness that I describe in this book should be fun in this way. When I was a little kid, I watched the Mickey Mouse show. And I remember Thursday, I think, was surprise day. And the Mouseketeers would sing a song. I'm not going to sing it. They would go like, surprise day, surprise day. Anything can happen. And it usually does, which I just love. Like anything can happen and it usually does. And that's the spirit of the book. Like what the hell's going to happen next? Anything might happen. And let's just see what happens instead of trying so hard to predict what's going to happen or assume so much that we already know what's going to happen. And then we'll just be refreshed, I hope. And we'll feel like the universe is re-enchanted just a little bit.
Oh, yeah, indeed. Yeah. I love you talk about list your top 5 weird actors, Eric. And yours are Tilda Swinton, Benicio del Toro, Forrest Whitaker, Uma Thurman, and Harry Dean Stanton. Twin Peaks, The Return, shout out for that one.
Yeah.
So I wrote some of my own, and so did Vance. Mine are Peter Sellers, Geoffrey Rush, Naomi Watts, Christopher Walken, and Malcolm McDowell. So those are good. What about you, Vince? Did you write your list?
Oh, yeah. I got 13 of them, but you want me to pick out 5 or read them quick?
Just read them quick.
All right. David Lynch, Jack Nance, Pee Wee Herman, Johnny Depp, Marty Feldman, Peter Sellers, Brad Pitt, Nicolas Cage. You ever see his face in Face Off? I can't believe how many faces that guy has.
Nobody's doubting Nicolas Cage's weirdness in this world. That's one actor. You know,
his credentials are stellar for the weird acting list.
Oh, yeah. Tilda Swinton, Jack Nicholson, Toni Collette. She's kind of my eye worm. Whenever I see that woman on the screen, I don't know.
Brilliant actress.
Weird, you know. And Steve Buscemi.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Those are all fantastic. I love that you mentioned Jack Nance. So, of course, it's kind of the strange actor, the Eraserhead actor.
Oh, yeah.
So good. And Peter Sellers and Marty Feldman. Those are really great. Those are good sort of 70s strange actors. I mean, we're Generation Xers, but Marty Feldman was I think he was in Young Frankenstein, the Gene Wilder film. Mel Brooks, and playing the Igor character.
Right. Just, walk like this.
Yeah, exactly. So good. Yeah.
Have you had a chance to watch Mandy or Color Out of Space, Eric?
I've not.
You have to watch both of them.
Yeah.
As a Gen Xer, you'll just love it. And they actually did a good job with Lovecraft. For once, we got a good Lovecraft movie. So. Good. That's good to see. Yeah. The other thing too is some of the exercises you have is 28, fabricate a story that has never existed before. 29, review books that do not exist. And of course, you're channeling your inner Jorge Luis Borges, a fellow Gnostic that we love. I forgot what story it is where there's this library that has every book that's never been written, and he talks about like the footnotes of Basilides' Gospel, books that you would never think.
I think that's the Library of Babel, and then there's the other story, Tlan Ukbar and Orbius Tertius, where he talks about this world that was written about in a history, and then it came to be. Yeah. And so that exercise, those 2 exercises were definitely written in that spirit. I have some exercises that have to do with kind of generating random experiences. Like one, as I say, go to the library and go to your favorite shelf and just close your eyes and like pull a book off the shelf and open it. And the first sentence you notice, write that as the first sentence, and then write a story, based on that sentence, 1-page story, and then put that story in the book and leave it there, thinking someone might find it later on.
Oh, wow.
That sort of thing. Yeah.
With my luck, I'd pull one and it would say, "It is a dark and stormy night."
Edward Leighton Bolton. Yeah, he wrote that too. But considered the worst line in history, but he also wrote one of the greatest lines: "The pen is mightier than the sword." So as writers, we have ups and downs.
That's right.
That history will remember. So there's number 30 where you talk about imagine your life as a peculiar novel written by a lazy god. So of course I'm like, aha, there's the demiurge right there.
There's the demiurge. Yeah. And what would you say? What would you say to this god? Like, she suddenly realized, like, dude, you wrote me a really terrible story. And then what kind of conversation would you have with this lazy god? So a lot of little mental exercises show up in the book too, like that.
Yeah, and there is another which we've talked about in the past, and you bring up again, and that's the idea of the Dadaists or the absurdists. Could you maybe share the audience quickly, because their work I still lean on it.
Yeah, so the Dadaists were kind of artistic collective that came about between the two world wars in the early part of the 20th century. And they basically concluded that reason, which had been sort of the crowning achievement of Western thought, because it was responsible for the horrific World War I and was about to be responsible for World War II, that the best way to rebel against the warlike spirit was to do that which was the exact opposite of reason. But in their case, not the irrational, which would just be the reversal of reason, but the irrational, like anything can go. So they would come up with all these sorts of games to generate absurdist experience. And the famous one is called the Exquisite Corpse, where you would get words in a hat, and you would kind of each person would draw a word, and then each person would be assigned a part of speech for a sentence. Like you're the noun, you're the verb, you're the adverb, you're the adjective, so on and so forth. And then the words would be strung together in a random way, and a sentence would come out. I think this one of the most famous ones is like the Exquisite Corpse will have wine for lunch or something like that. So there are all kinds of games that, and William Burroughs practiced some of these games too, by the way. The beat writer in the 50s, he would take pages from his novels and then throw them on the floor and mix them up and then put them back together again. And that would be the novel. The idea that life is already random anyway. So to sort of inject your art with randomness, yes, it can make it surprising and compelling, but also it's just sort of an accurate way of reflecting what human experience is really like. So the Dadaists were hugely influential on this book. And of course, the Dadaists were influential in someone like Salvador Dali. There's a fine line. I mean, Dadaism merges into surrealism pretty quickly with people like Andre Breton and Salvador Dali.
Yeah, definitely advise people to follow the work. Vance, any question from you or the audience?
I don't see questions in the audience yet, unless I missed them. But yeah, I was wondering if, Erica, if you could talk about the etymology of the word weird. I think it's extremely relevant.
Gladly. that was in the book at one point, and my publisher said, I think that's a little too pedantic. But weird is an old English word, W-Y-R-D. And it shows up in Old English poetry of, like, say, Beowulf. It means fate, roughly. The idea that there's some sort of principle in the universe determining action. But the word actually, by the time we get to the early modern period or the Renaissance period, and with Shakespeare and Macbeth, it's taken on other meanings, to the point where the witches in Macbeth are called the Weird Sisters, meaning that they are in touch with fate, but also they're in touch with the occult and the strange. And so that's how the word kind of came to take on the meaning it does for us today. Vance, you may have some more information on that. It looks like you were
just a little bit, which is to transcend fate, to rise above fate. See, which is why people do magic, right? That was a big theme way back when.
Yeah.
So to be weird, you could transcend fate, and fate being mechanical, going with the flow, and not having any will of your own, and so forth.
I love that part of the definition, and I actually play around a little bit with some occult activities in my book as well. I give a little history of the tarot deck and suggest that people make their own tarot deck and see what happens there. I suggest people draw a magic circle, such as people who practice Wiccan might do. Not in a sort of heavy way, but like, you can use couch cushions, but the idea of like creating a kind of sacred space for yourself just for like 10 minutes and see what that's about. I say create a divining rod. see if you walk around with those forks and see if you can get some vibrations. Those sorts of things. Again, I'm not taking them too seriously as metaphysical actions, but I do think to sort of dabble in the idea that there are forces beyond our rational control. And maybe they are metaphysical, maybe they are spiritual. We don't know. But I think those to think about those things are just other ways to open us up to something different than we might normally think about in our daily lives.
Yeah. Occult fan wants to know what you think of the weirdness of the blood of someone, say, who was hung in Salem.
I don't understand. Yeah.
That's heavy.
Yeah.
Well, I think he means like in other words, if you inherited, if you were a descendant of someone maybe,
Yeah.
and you had blood or something, it's
Oh yeah,
weird.
that's a very Hawthornian, Nathaniel Hawthorne like question. I'm thinking of House of the Seven Gables, which is all about a curse, like the curse of Salem witches.
Yeah.
So I think that weirdness can take on all kinds of forms. I mean, one would be a more traditionally Gothic weirdness, which would have to do with sort of the occult and darkness and trauma and melancholy and all that sort of thing. And those are legitimately weird experiences. Absolutely. And I think to brood on the Gothic can also ultimately, strangely enough, be a healthy thing to do. Because I mean, America, and I've talked about this, Miguel. I mean, there's something kind of very antiseptically anti-Gothic about mainstream America. Always has been, all the way back to the Salem witch trials. So, to cultivate kind of a Gothic spirit and be open to uncanniness, and again, deja vu, hypnagogia, seeing the same number several times in one day, getting lost, coming back to the same place. Those are experiences that we would categorize as Gothic. And the more we can cultivate those, I think the better.
Certainly, I would agree too. Another section you talk about, Eric, and in your section 42, in the answer to the universe, I know 42, is sacralize the absurd. And you talk about memento mori, which is very popular today, about think about death and so forth. And I think exercises 51, 52, you talk about write an obituary and rub a tombstone. So that is important, realizing that time is short. We are finite beings. So that is the biggest changer of our perspective and worldview, knowing we're going to die. There's an exercise I do, Eric, and I've shared it from a Sufi master. He says, when you wake up in the morning, say, today I'm going to die. There is no God but Allah. If you know you're going to die today, you're going to live a completely different day.
Yeah. No, there is a wisdom to keeping the skull on the desk that scholars and monks did for centuries. In that exercise where I say sacralize the absurd, I kind of poke a tiny bit of fun at that memento mori, mainly because you see the skulls everywhere now, right? You see them on handbags and scarves and tattoos, and
Stoicism's very hip with
it's very
millennials.
It's very hip, and which is fine. I love
great.
skulls. I love skulls, but so that exercise, sacralize the absurd, actually grows out of one of my favorite passages in Moby Dick, where Ishmael, the narrator of that novel, is left out on a tiny whaling ship all night long, thinking he's been left by the main vessel, the Pequod, and he gives himself up for dead. But then he's rescued the next morning, and he says to one of his friends, Queequeg, a harpooner, he says, "Gosh, is it always like this whaling?" And he's like, "Yeah, man, every day." And so Ishmael says, "Okay, I realize that if there is a God, he's a practical joker. And you know what? When you're the butt of a joke, you can get mad at the joker, or you can just go along with it and laugh at it." So this idea of like sacralize the absurd, I give the example of, say you're walking to the bathroom one night and your daughter has left a marble on the floor, and you step on that marble and you like trip and you bang into the bookshelf, and like this precious vase you got in China falls on the floor. Like, instead of getting angry at that, make a shrine of the marble and just use it as a way to remind you, don't take things so seriously. So it's it is a kind of anti-memento mori in that way. World's absurd. Go with it.
Yeah, or the Lego instead of the marble.
The Legos are the worst.
Painful.
They're so worse.
And Moby Dick, as we've discussed, the great American novel, is ironically the great Gnostic gospel. I always think it's funny. England's poet is a Gnostic. It's almost like the Gnostics kind of slid it in, or what's the other one? It's ironic how they got away. But you write Herman Melville, he had to change his worldview and perspective just to write Moby Dick, right? He had to be weird. He had to be weird.
He had to be weird. And what happened with, Melville was writing really popular adventure novels early on. He wrote a novel called Typee about his time among this tribe in the Pacific Ocean, and it was kind of a romantic, exotic travelogue. It was a bestseller. And then he wrote a couple other books that we would just qualify as sort of sea adventure novels. But then he met Hawthorne, and Hawthorne had written Scarlet Letter, House of the Seven Gables, and Hawthorne blew his mind. And then he started reading Shakespeare and Plato, and he read about the Gnostic in this famous 18th century reference work, Bayle's Encyclopedia, which had entries on all the major Gnostics. Of course, in Melville's time, that information would have come from the theologians who were anti-heretical, people along those lines, and in Origen, for instance. So it's like Melville opened up to this kind of Hawthornian Gothic sensibility. And Moby Dick started out as another adventure tale with Ishmael kind of on this happy-go-lucky whaling cruise. But then, like 120 pages in, Melville had already written that part. He met Hawthorne, and then he put Ahab in there. So instead of like rewriting the first 120 pages, he just left them the same. So it's almost like you can see these two novels pushing against each other, the sort of dark Gnostic Ahabian vision and this more sort of playful, ironic Ishmaelian vision. It's really, really fascinating.
Yeah, Nathaniel Hawthorne was just basically history's first hippie. I mean, you always think of this like, smart intellectual, but he lived in a commune and he was part of the Boston liberals, the first wave of liberalism.
Really? Huh, weird.
Yeah.
Well, he did live in Brook Farm commune for a year. Actually, it's interesting you bring that up, Miguel. I mean, Hawthorne lived in this hippy-dippy commune, Brook Farm, but he did it so he could raise enough money to marry the woman he wanted to marry, Sophia Peabody. So he's there for purely financial reasons. And then he bailed on it. And I mean, Hawthorne was educated at Bowdoin College. We went to college with Franklin Pierce there, who became president. So his politics were a little weird. I mean, he was friends with Emerson and Thoreau, who were very liberal. But Hawthorne himself, on the slavery question, on the women question, kind of not so palatable. But that complexity of his soul is, I think, part of what makes him different from someone like Emerson or Thoreau, because he's willing to go in kind of the dark spaces of the psyche, where Thoreau and Emerson, they're not really interested in that.
People are complex, and that's the beauty, and certainly the beauty of being weird. There is a part where you have some great write your own aphorisms, and I wanted to share some with the audience. I'm like, he's doing a great job tapping into the inner Emile Cioran or Woody Allen or somebody like that. Here's a couple for the audience. I'll read them. Live this day as if it's your last, and you will run around screaming, "I'm going to fucking die." So much for Memento Mori, or the Sufi prayer.
When you were telling me about the Sufi morning edition, I was thinking about that. Yeah,
it's like, and Hannah and her sisters, when Woody Allen is freaking out about death, and he goes into the movie theater. Well, he tries to commit suicide, and like Philip K. Dick had, we were so sweaty. The gun, he shot the gun, and he goes in and sees a Marx Brothers movie, and he realizes what you're talking about in your book. Take it easy. Life is short. Just have fun. So.
Yeah, that's it. That's a great moment. I'm glad Emile Cioran. I mean, I haven't talked. I mean, his Short History of Decay, by the way, is just a major book for me. And and he captures exactly. I mean, there's something very acerbic about his writing, but there's a wit to it as well. I'm glad you brought him up. A great aphoristic writer.
Yeah. We did a show about a month ago, and our guest, of course, it's no secret. He wrote about the Demiurge and the Gnostics. He tapped into their energy, like Blake and all these other guys. So when it comes to aphorisms, I think gives Oscar Wilde a run for his money, if you know what I mean.
Yes.
Here's a couple of other good ones. Never go to bed angry. Drunk is much better. Failure isn't final. It's also at the beginning and in the middle.
Man, I worked on those three. Those are the only three that I wrote. I give examples from Wilde and others that I worked so hard on those. And I'd read like drafts to my daughter. She goes, "That is so not funny, Dad." I kept working and working and working. So I'm really proud of the three I came up with. And I had my students do this exercise in class the other day, and they came up with some pretty good stuff. I mean, it's kind of interesting if you just write a cliche and then think about, well, how can I like riff on that cliche? That's kind of how it works. And it's interesting. It was interesting for my students to do that for fun, but also just to kind of problematize a cliche. So.
No, it makes sense. And with your students, Eric, just sort of picking your brain, there's sort of two attitudes, and I'm sure both work. There's sort of the Neil Gaiman, I just make up stories as I go, and this is me pretending. And then there's, of course, the more Alan Moore, J.R. Tolkien, Carl Jung were like, no, we go into the imaginal of Henry Corbin, and these stories are there waiting for us. The worlds are there, and we just have to access the soul in our stories. What do you tell your students when, of course, writer's block, or what do I write next, Professor?
I love that question. I would say until about 5 years ago, I was very much in the Alan Moore camp. The idea that there are these kind of archetypes, mythological archetypes out there, and they're rich, and you can mine them, and you can endlessly translate them into your own narratives. And you can still do that. I'm not saying I discount that. But as my own writing has become, I guess, looser and more playful, I've tended to be more in the Gaiman camp. Just play around with your own thoughts and your own weirdness and your own idiosyncrasies and see what happens. Of course, oftentimes the two worlds will collide anyway. you go deep into myth, you'll come out on the other side as more yourself. You go deep into yourself, you come on the other side into the myth. Often happens.
Yeah, or again, a little bit of both. And I know F. Scott Fitzgerald said, to find your voice takes a million words. That was chilling, but it's true, right? You got to tell them, keep writing. Your voice will come. That's the best news when you find out your voice, because you're kind of finding out your soul, who you
There's
are.
nothing like it as a writer. And I didn't find my voice as a writer, I don't think, until I was about 45 or 50 even. I mean, because I was trained as an academic. And that means you're writing, academic prose, which you're not really encouraged to be creative, and you kind of learn a jargon. And it's almost like writing a sonnet at a certain point. You can sort of do it endlessly. And when I just started to write creatively with books like Against Happiness and Everyone Loves a Good Train Wreck, even with those books, I feel like there was a kind of heavy scholarly voice. But I think in the last 5 years, really, I like writing more because I write like I think inside my head now, in a very sort of relaxed way. And I care less about word choice and more about like syntax and rhythm now. And that it feels amazing to find that. But I'm 55 now. And I tell my students that, like, oh God, it takes that long. I said, no, you can get a head start. You can start trying now. And I didn't really start trying until my 40s to create my own literary voice.
Yeah, it's like that saying, God, who wrote Even Cowgirls Get the Blues? What's his name? Tom Robbins.
Tom Robbins, yeah.
Yeah, one of my favorite quotes, it's never too late to have a happy childhood. So you can access that child, that being that was so close to the undivided unconscious.
I love that.
It's all there for the taking. And Vance, any questions from the audience? I think I saw a few.
Graham Pong, our buddy, wanted to know your thoughts, Eric, on Alfred Jarry, father of pataphysics.
Oh yeah, Alfred Jarry, the pataphysics guy. I spent. Let me think about this. In my book, Keep It Fake, I had a whole section on Jarry, because I mean the idea of his use of performance, like riding the bicycle around, and there was just something so kind of, he was like an early Charlie Chaplin, an early Buster Keaton, someone who saw living as art and just sort of behaving in these ridiculous, absurd ways. So I don't know his work deeply, but he was an inspiration for me at that time. And definitely, even though he doesn't appear in this book, that pataphysical vibe is in here for sure.
What is pataphysical?
Well, pataphysics it's not metaphysics. It's like it's not physics. It's kind of it's almost like a way of saying the world is absurd. The world is Dadaistic. The world is surreal. And pataphysics is a kind of science, not of the real, but of the surreal. It's kind of how I've taken it. It shows up in the Beatles song, Maxwell's Silver Hammer, right? Studied pataphysical. No.
Oh, is that what they were saying?
pataphysical, I think.
Oh,
I think.
okay.
always check behind me, but I think so. Yeah. That's a good question. I'm glad to think about, Jerry, for a second. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, Alcohol Fan wanted me to mention Infinite Jest to you.
Oh, huge David Foster Wallace fan. Massive. Infinite Jest is one of the most important books I've ever read. And I've got a couple of things to say about David Foster Wallace. One is and this is probably true of a lot of writers, his voice was so powerful that it influenced me so profoundly that for about 3 years, I tried to write like David Foster Wallace. And it was a miserable failure because no one can write like David Foster Wallace. No. I mean, I wrote a whole book. I think it was the Keep It Fake book. I sent it to my publisher and she goes, "This sounds like you're trying to write like David Foster Wallace. This is unpublishable." It's like, what? Oops. So I have to you got to rewrite the whole thing. And that's kind of when I discovered my own voice. So, but David Foster Wallace, I mean, he's such a compelling figure in relation to my subject matter because he valued irony immensely, both as a writer of fiction and as a writer of nonfiction. But also he feared irony. He was afraid that our culture had become so ironic to where we couldn't really value anything anymore. We just kind of mocked everything. So he wanted to find a way to sort of, well, in his famous lecture, This Is Water, he said, say you're standing in line at the grocery store and you're being annoyed immensely by this woman and her 3 kids. They're just like, she's like flustered. She can't check out because she's getting all her change out. She's holding you up. The kids are screaming. They're pulling magazines down. And he said, you could be really angry at that point. Or you could imagine that her husband has cancer and she spent all night caring for him. And in other words, create a narrative. Doesn't matter if it's true or not. And that's the irony. Creating a narrative that is fictional, but then treating it as if it's not fictional, treating it as if it's real. And that leads to a kind of ethical sensibility. That's very powerful. And I feel like one reason Wallace couldn't finish his last novel, The Pale King, which was mostly finished when he committed suicide, because I feel like it's almost like he got too paralyzed by the idea that I can't escape irony. It's like he wanted. So the novel's about accountants, and they sit all day and do tax returns. And Wallace's idea was, if you can do tax returns all day and still find value in life, then you've mastered everything. But the novel didn't go anywhere. It's like he became like too caught up in the idea of trying to represent the banality of reality, and then he couldn't write a novel anymore. Anyway, I could go on and on about David Foster Wallace. Huge hero for me in every way.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
Well, I was wondering about weird music. I'm going to guess, Eric, that you like They Might Be Giants.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the famous Istanbul, Constantinople, I still love. But they actually did an album of children's songs that I would play for my daughter, kind of songs about counting and learning. Amazing. No, they're great. Are they still around? Are they still making music? I don't know.
Yeah, they're on Facebook and they're doing this and that. I don't know if they're that popular anymore, but they're around.
Yeah. A Gen X band for sure.
Yeah, definitely.
That's for sure. And as we're getting to the top of the hour and the end of the interview, I know in one of my favorite books in our first interview, I owned all of your books. They're in my shelves, Eric.
You're a good friend,
yeah. But Gnostic Cinema, Secret Cinema, Gnostic Vision and Film is still one of my favorite books because you not just break down, people go, oh, Gnostic themes, you break down the different types, Valentinian, alchemical.
Yeah.
And in our interview in 2018, we both had like a huge kind of bro sigh of relief because Twin Peaks: The Return not only did disappoint, it really was even better than everything that Lynch has done. But since then, have you watched any good Gnostic movies or novels or anything? Because there's a lot of it now that the multiverse and simulation is so popular in fiction. So it's almost like an embarrassment of riches or diluted. But I can't really think of anything except maybe the TV series Legion, but that was 2017.
Yeah, I'm drawing a bit of a blank on that. I mean, I feel like the late 90s, early aughts was just the sort of golden age for Gnosticism and popular culture. I mean, not only with the film I write about, but also with the Alan Moore comics. And of course, they're being made into films quite frequently now. And even with films like adaptation, just this idea that the world is, or Vanilla Sky, the idea that this world is fictional. But I guess because I'm not thinking about Gnosticism in that formalized way, like I was when we had those conversations, probably a lot's just not on my radar.
Right.
Yeah.
Mother, it's already 5 years old, but
yeah, Darren Aronofsky's Mother. Yeah, straight out of the Kabbalah.
Yeah, I haven't seen that. So yeah,
Yeah,
I'm out of the loop. Yeah.
You
Oh, you
really
gotta
are
see
out
it.
of.
I'm out of the
You'd love
loop.
it.
I'm a backsliding Gnostic. I got to get my faith back in order. Yeah.
Talk about weird.
Good.
That is a weird movie.
I
That's
love
a very weird
Aronofsky.
movie.
Okay, good. Thank you. I'll give that a look for sure.
Yeah.
For sure. Well, awesome. Yeah. And any other last exercise you want to share? Like I told the audience, there's 99 of them. Some are short, some are long. You'll find something that you'll really enjoy. I think you have one, for example, William Blake, carry a portable doors of perception.
That's exactly what I was going to mention. Yeah.
Oh, well, there you go. Let's end with that one.
Synchronicity there, Miguel. Yeah. I mean, Blake famously said, when the doors of perception are cleansed, the world will appear as it is, infinite. So I say, get an index card and draw a doorknob on it and carry it around with you. And when you're feeling bored, stick it on a wall and just imagine like what's behind the door. And again, it's just a way of pulling yourself out of the ordinary. But that's ultimately the spirit of the book. Is the world's a lot bigger and stranger than most of us give it credit for, and most of us fear the bigness and the strangeness, and I'm guilty of that too. So I would say the book is in some ways a self-help book. It's kind of a tongue-in-cheek, ironic self-help book, but ultimately it's meant to help you live a happier life and hopefully it has a therapeutic value. And I'm a man who needs therapeutic value in my life, having suffering bipolar disorder, as I know you do too, Miguel. So if you check out the book, hopefully it'll be fun for you, and hopefully it just make you feel a little better of a day.
Oh, it will. You guys will laugh. I laughed. You'll laugh even more. We just scratched the surface. So, yes, and I have here, your website is ericgwilson.net. For those, it will be in the show notes. Your book is available everywhere.
Everywhere. Also in audio form for the first time.
Oh,
excited about that. Yeah.
Did you narrate it?
No, Penguin, my publisher, hired an actress. It's actually a woman reading. She reads it beautifully.
I was just thinking he's got to have a woman do.
Oh, it had to be.
Just again twisted, turn it around. Perfect, perfect. Well, awesome. Well, the audience, you guys had some good comments, good questions. I had a few questions that was brought separately, but Eric addressed them as we were talking about all these different things. So thank you for housekeeping. We'll have another couple AB lives next week with some very cool topics on who is God, the archons and astrology, then a show on hermetic healing, both the psychic and the mind. So a lot of good, useful stuff for you guys to get ready for the holidays. This book will help you with the holidays as things get really intense with the ego. So thanks for everybody's support and being here. And Vance, thank you for being here.
Oh, it's fun. Great to be with you, Eric. And of course, always great to be with you, Miguel.
Thanks,
and our wonderful viewers.
Yeah. Good. Smart guys, smarter than us. Sometimes I think the audience far smarter than us, which is a great thing. So Eric, as always, it's great having you on the show. And as always, I hope we talk sooner rather than later. And for everyone, as I say, well, thank you, Eric.
You're welcome.
To go on a speech.
My pleasure. Yeah.
Well, as I always say, everybody have a good weekend, and write your own gospel, live your own myth, and thank you. Take care, everybody.